Kia ora koutou, ko Victoria McLennan, toka wingoa. Please call me Vic, everyone does. I am here with the latest IT Professionals Fireside chat, and I'm having a chat with Andrew Cushion from The Code. Kia ora, Andrew.
Kia ora, Vic. Tēnā koutou, everybody. Everybody usually calls me Kush, since everybody usually calls you Vic. Vic.
Well, I wasn't going to assume that I could just be that casual and familiar with you, so
That's
I
true.
thought I'd better check. Well, it's a great way to kick off anyway, and welcome everyone for joining us today. We'll be having a chat for about 45 minutes. And first of all, Kush, I'll call you Kush. Let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself, your potted history, and what took you up until this role, and then we'll talk about this role.
Well, it amazes me that this is actually the 20th year for me of having real jobs, because it's 20 years ago this year that I started working in big telco for Vodafone, where I worked for a while before working for a bit with Telstra Clear. And I've subsequent to all of that done some time on Gravity. So one strand of my career has been very much in the telco regulatory policy corporate affairs space. I spent 8 years working for Internet NZ as well, in a variety of different roles. But over the last 3 years, I've been working on a portfolio basis myself, which includes this executive directorship of the code, alongside some work that I do in forestry, and alongside things like doing some work on disinfo, the government. So that's broadly
Nice.
me.
Well, it's good that there's someone who's working on this information for the government. It's always good to hear. So today we're here to talk about the code, and from the horse's mouth, what is the code and what was the motivation behind developing it?
Mm. First question first. The code is a voluntary, signatory funded piece of self-regulation on online safety and harms. And so I'm going to use its full name, which we don't use often because it is a little bit of a mouthful. It is the Aotearoa New Zealand Code of Practice for Online Safety and Harms. And what it does is that it seeks to address key areas around bullying, child safety, disinfo, harassment, hate speech, all of that across 13 different outcome areas with 45 different specific measures that require the signatories to report on each year and to have those reports independently inspected. And in doing so, it provides a set of commitments that those signatories are making to this country, Aotearoa. We have 5 signatories at the moment, and they are Meta across Instagram and Facebook, of course. We've got Google, including YouTube. We've got the good people at TikTok. We've got X, aka Twitter, as it was once known. Then we've got Twitch. So that's the code. Now, as for the motivation for forming it, I wasn't there when it was formed. I've been doing this role now across the last 3 or 4 months. So what the motivations were is part of the legends that I hear, but broadly speaking, what it was done to do is at least ground these organisations with a method here in New Zealand that means that there is some hook, some tie, some set of commitments specific to us and our values. And that was in part response to the rise of a lot of these concerns in terms of utilisation and everything else following the lockdowns and all of the COVID stuff. So there's a quick 101 about what the code does. That's who's a member of it, that's how it works, and why it came about, at least as I've heard.
Nice. And yeah, it's always hard when you take over something that someone else set up, right? To be able to describe the origins. Now, for everyone who's watching and listening to this, you can ask questions via the Q&A function, and I'll relay those to Kush. And otherwise, I'm just going to turn through a list of questions that I've got here. So the first one is, I know that our audience is really interested to understand how the code is governed and enforced. So what are the mechanisms in place to ensure compliance with the code?
So I referred to a few of those already, and I'm going to pick up on the different bits that you just asked about there. little bit at random, because the governance arrangements, I think, are an important part of this. There is an
Mm.
independent oversight committee that is essentially the governing body of the code, and they're drawn from the community. All of the names of the people are on our website. Now, they are the governors of what they do, and essentially the people that tell me as the executive director what to do here too. As executive director, my job is to be the person on the ground of the code. I don't speak for the signatories. We don't speak for the signatories. They speak to us, so to speak, in terms of telling us every year how they meet those particular commitments that they have made. There is the ability for anybody, actually, to make a complaint that they think one of the signatories isn't meeting those commitments that they've made in the code themselves. They are judged by the oversight committee. And the ultimate prohibition, which frankly I'd hope you'd never use, is that we can suspend and remove an organisation from membership of the code as a result of them not meeting those particular commitments. So those broadly are how this structure works, right? A set of commitments that they make publicly, that they report on each year, that we get Dr. Philippa Smith to have a look at each year and do a sort of meta-level summary of what comes through the report and make both recommendations to the oversight committee and to the signatories themselves about how they can further improve. The ability to make complaints and the ultimate sanction too, to remove people that don't do it. I think there's a really important point here about the moral imperative of it all, that these are commitments that those orgs themselves have made and the potential for essentially not living up to what they themselves committed to if they don't do it. And I think that's pretty powerful.
So you just mentioned that there's this annual kind of reporting cycle and discussion. Does an element of that then get publicised? Can we all go and have a look at that?
Absolutely. Our website is thecode.org.nz. You'll see 3 different generations of reports on behalf of each of the signatories. A baseline report that was done at the formation, and then 2 of the annual cycles, as well as 2 times of that meta-level independent review of reports as well. And all of that is on the website in terms of the cycle of feedback that they are getting about how they can lift and improve things.
So in reality, from your experience, and you've been involved for 3 months, and I know you're employed by the code, so you might not be able to answer this as openly as I might hope, but do you think it's got any teeth?
Yeah, I reckon I can answer this in 2 ways. So this is way number 1. That moral imperative, I think, is quite powerful. Because this is a self-regulatory mechanism, this is wholly voluntary to come in and make these commitments to Aotearoa. Likewise, it is wholly reputational to not meet those commitments that they themselves made. I actually think that that's an underestimated aspect of this, right? This is the commitments that these platforms themselves made to this instrument in order to deliver upon these commitments to all of us. And I think that's actually more powerful than people might think it is, I think. The second way I could answer that question, Vic, is to say, actually, I think that teeth is the wrong frame. I don't think it's right for something to... It's not quite the way the code was ever been set up to have a toothy, bitey response on these particular things. It's something more that's more forceful than I think this was ever intended to be. Instead, what you've had is these organisations making commitments, subjecting themselves to independent scrutiny on those, independent governance on those, and some hook of community conversation and engagement as we do reviews, which is something I'll come back to. And again, so I don't think Heath is quite right. It's a case of they committed. We have instruments to monitor that commitment that is made and refresh that commitment that is made. Otherwise, they back off the commitment and take the moral burden that they take. See what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. So you kind of opened the door a bit on this. And how does the code ensure that Māori, Pacifica, and other communities who experience disproportionate harm online, so I could include women, for example, in that, are truly heard and protected under the code? How does that protect those segments of our society?
Mm. So if I was to describe the way I see the code operating, it takes a behaviours content lens first, rather than a specific communities of interest lens. And that, I know, is an area that different stakeholders have sought to give feedback on over time. But because this is behavioural focused, and those measures are specifically about the areas of potential harm and safety, rather than stakeholder focused, I can't say specifically there are clauses related to Māori Pacifica and other communities, because instead they're bundled into the particular behaviours that could cause harm instead. All that said, I am told that as this was generated the first time, it was done with involvement of many of the stakeholder groups via a public consultation process that resulted in change to this as it was developed. Now, should we take a different approach to how this is described? That's exactly what we need to keep in touch of in terms of whether or not this code remains relevant to the values, the interests, and the communities that it's purporting to serve. And that's the review that we'll come back to,
Right.
actually quite shortly, actually in the next couple of months.
Okay.
I won't steal our thunder from talking about that yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, well, we're going to kind of start to creep there now. So let's talk a bit about regulation. There's a lot of discussion about regulation.
Yep.
Every time I have a member meet up, people talk about regulation. And there's a lot of frustration at the moment about proposals like the under 16 social media ban is essentially regulating the consumers instead of regulating the platforms, hence a lot of talk about regulation. So do you think government regulation of platforms is necessary, or can a voluntary code like this one do the job that our citizens need?
I'm going to take a side step at first and then come back to that, actually, because across my time in the various places that I've worked, I've spent a fair bit of time in self-regulation, right? Telcos, a lot of our telco infrastructure is governed by industry self-regulation, at a variety of different tiers, voluntary codes, regulated codes of practice where the commission is involved, legislation at the highest level too. Another example, .nz and Internet NZ run the .nz infrastructure on essentially what is self-regulation as well. And so self-regulation isn't unusual in this country. It's not unusual worldwide as well, right? It's a different tool from what government regulation is. And so when I address that question of whether or not can voluntary codes do the job, it depends on what job we're talking about, really, because they're different tools for different jobs. Now, this one, a lot like some of those other instruments, is a voluntary self piece of regulation that can do certain things. And this one's designed to have those different commitments to Aotearoa met and reported upon. That's different to the way that governments could do things, I think. So what is the job that we would be talking about?
And so it kind of leads to my next question, though, that one of the criticisms I've heard of the code is it was a way for the platforms to get ahead of regulation being imposed on them. Has that kind of come up in your discussion since you've been in the role?
I mean, I would be unsighted and unhearing if I hadn't have heard this concern, and I am not unsighted, unhearing in terms of this. And again, it comes back to what is the job that we are trying to do here. There are a lot of benefits to self-regulation, actually. And again, I say that with reference to having done a bit of self-regulation in those other industries too. Self-regulation usually moves faster and is usually more flexible than other forms of government regulation because it's developed by the sector that's being regulated itself. It's often more tangible, if that makes sense, because it's essentially regulation designed by the people that have to eat it and report upon it themselves. And I think that then gets you to a point of ownership about it that some of the other instruments don't do. I mean, essentially, to put it colloquially, you've written it yourself, you apply to it yourself, you have an ownership stake on it when you are writing those rules yourself. So that would be the first point. It's a different type shape tool, again, for I think a different job. But equally too, I think that, and again, those examples I think hold that I talked about before, these things often work together. They're not, industry self-regulation is not a substitute for government regulation. It's usually actually more of a complement for it instead, because they do different things in different ways. Now, the other observation that I'd make, and I actually make this as somebody who has been around this space for a while, right, rather than speaking for the code, actually. So this is Andrew Cushion, private citizen talking. I think you, Vic, and everybody on this call would realise that legislating in this space, government-imposed regulation in this space, is mind-bogglingly difficult, right? And that's due to any number of different issues that come up. And I'm not going to list them all, but the ones that jump off top of my mind are jurisdictional issues, philosophical issues, commercial issues. I'm not going to keep going, actually.
Technical. Let's just get into those. Yeah.
Right. And that's why you see so few, if any, from the last time I looked at it, that actually have regulation in this space. Could this be different? Probably it can be different. This is a conversation that has been happening in earnest, actually, ever since the tragedy that was the Christchurch attacks and the Christchurch call, which tried to elevate all of this regulation conversation into a more multinational space. And I can see that you've got Paul coming, so I don't want to steal Paul's thunder from a future Fireside chat, right? But the Christchurch call has done a lot of great work, but hasn't necessarily ended in a regulatory legislative space here too, despite that massive moral lift that it had around it. So, and again too, I feel like I'm ranting now, so I'll keep this brief. We've already seen a regulatory attempt in round these issues in terms of the Safer Online media platforms work that was abandoned by the new government. This is really hard to do, to have regulation and legislation. So I have heard that argument. I'm sympathetic to that argument. And with my previous hats on, I've said plenty about questioning the role that platforms play and the relevance to and the adherence to New Zealand standards, right? I think it is good that we have a self-regulatory instrument because it does a piece of the puzzle. It doesn't do all of the puzzle, and it was never going to do all of the puzzle. But I think it complements if and when we have a basis to legislate or regulate centrally and by government.
I must admit to reflecting that I thought it was a stroke of genius having you take on this role, given your previous roles and your, views in this kind of space, so that you've come from that world of how do we protect people on the internet generally into this very specific world of how do the platforms actually put a code of conduct, for want of a better word, around themselves. So yeah, the irony wasn't lost on me, Kush, don't worry. While you've got your Andrew Cushion private citizen hat on, I'm going to ask you one of the questions from the message board, which is quite very much going back to your old life. The upcoming Internet New Zealand AGM will be held under the shadow of the Free Speech Union members attempting to infiltrate and bend it to their will, being Internet New Zealand. What safeguards does Internet New Zealand have against that kind of subterfuge? It's a pretty loaded question. It's not specifically something you can answer with your current head on, but do you have any reckons on situations like the one that Internet New Zealand's just found themselves in, with one body of people with vested interest getting involved to try and affect change?
I've spent a lot of time working for a variety of different incorporated societies, et cetera, et cetera. I think, actually, let me add this caveat first. I spent 8 wonderful years working for Internet NZ, and over the past 3 years, I have been but a mere member, like many of the people may be on top of this too. And it's not my place to talk about their specific arrangements on that too. I know, Vic, you can find plenty of people inside that organisation that could talk about that. But with my private member hat on and reflecting on that other experience that I've had in other incorporated societies and the like, this is part of the course. You have a membership proposition that people can either take up or not, and that leads you to a set of democratic norms as per whatever constitution that you have. And this is what's playing out here. And I disagree with some of the positions that some of the newer members are taking inside Internet NZ, and I am but one voice as a member of Internet NZ that has a different point of view on some of those things. Some of them, alternatively, I agree with. I look forward to seeing how Internet NZ deals with that.
Thank you. Sorry, took you off on a tangent, but thought it'd better be asked. Okay, the lovely Kim, who you and I both know very well, other than commenting that we're both looking good, has asked a relatively long and complex question. So here we go. I have a question for Kush about scope. Online harm is unfortunately a very broad church. I'm wondering whether harm from scams would come within the scope of the code in Measure 5, work to collaborate across industry and with other relevant stakeholders to respond to evolving threats. If not in scope, is there a way you could help to bring platforms to the table with the telcos, banks, government, and community to make commitments around fighting scams? Perhaps a joint code on scams is needed.
Hi, Kim. Thank you. That, I think, is a really interesting question. Arguably, yeah, in terms of that provision, in terms of collaboration and everything else. And again, with my private user hat on many of these platforms, and just as a technology-minded person as well, the amount of scam-based activity that I like to think I'm relatively competent in identifying, reporting, and managing seems to be increasing as far as I can see it too. So I don't think that the current set of approaches are working enough to deal with the challenge. And if there is a role where the code and the code signatories can play on that, I would love to explore it.
Great. And is that kind of thing in the remit of your role as Executive Director for the code?
I see this as a great big, almost sort of meeting house and balancing act role, to be truly honest, right? On one hand, those set of platforms with all of those challenges that we talked about of extraterritoriality and jurisdiction, and to be really blunt, many of them don't have people here in New Zealand to talk with. So in a sense, balancing the fact that I am a person that can talk to them and tell them about what's happening here versus balancing some of that community expectation and how it's manifested as expectation from what New Zealand needs, balancing against that governance and oversight committee piece of what they think makes it credible. I mean, I might be in breach of my contract, but I see that particular set of things as the balancing role as the heart of this thing, to be the one person who sits in the middle of all of that and tries to jiggle and jostle and hold all of that in an instrument that can continue to do something about this, basically.
Must make for a pretty interesting day then, I imagine.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, look, for example, the under 16 thing that came up. Now, on one hand, is a potential legislated response to a set of harms in a specific community, right? And on the other hand, right, the code, again, because it takes a behavioral focus rather than a particular set of stakeholders or users focused, isn't an under 16 code. I mean, under 16 is but one of the set of users or people here in Aotearoa that would apply to. So the under 16 ban is not something that is in scope, so to speak, about the code, but it's broadly in that safety space. And I think too that's actually a manifestation of a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of how difficult it is to have legislation in these things in this space. That actually we're going to be on the front line of seeing how it plays out if and when that gets pulled out of the biscuit.
So can I take you on a slightly different tangent? Kay's got a question about when you have complaints about things that occur on the platforms, such as getting a platform to act on its own community standards or complaints about scams that you see on the platforms. Are you the place to go with those complaints?
So we have, and again, the code.org.nz outlines not only our complaints process, but also our complaints approach and policy in terms of how we do things. Right? Essentially, you signal it to us that you have a complaint. That'll need to be denominated in terms of the particular commitment that you think across those outcomes and measures that we have that you think is in question. And essentially, we then do the discovery process to go back and work with the platform and say, tell us how, right? Tell us how that particular bit is or is not being met. And ultimately, then that independent oversight committee is the arbiter of whether or not there is satisfaction in that regard. That's how you do it.
Right. Okay, good to know. And I'm just going to ask you one more of the Q&A audience questions before I go back to my questions. This from Alan, he's concerned that two of the platforms both have a history of promoting mis and disinformation within their algorithm or allowing mis and disinformation to come through in their algorithm. Can you share an example of how the code can affect that behaviour so that to get the platforms to stop allowing the mis and disinformation through their algorithms? Is that within your scope?
I mean, yeah, because the code speaks to these particular things, right? And they are required to have an approach to managing it as one of the commitments in the code, right? The big challenge, and I say this as having done some work in this space as well, right, is definitional, right?
Right.
What they apply as mis and disinformation, how you objectively measure and tell what is mis and disinformation, what the different policy requirements are of mis and disinformation, exactly what the prohibition should be when there is mis and disinformation. Hard, really hard. So broadly, yes, it is one of the sets of commitments that the code seeks to do. And if you see a space where though you don't think a measure or an outcome is being met in the code, you should complain about that because ultimately that's what keeps this ecosystem working, right? That's how we find out whether and how that particular piece is working with regard to Aotearoa here. That would be a good thing to do, right? Because it tests the mechanism. But my caveat would be that these things are so hard to define that there is such room for interpretation on. And I'm not, I could see the potential for some of our dear leaders to be rolling their eyes with frustration here. But believe me, this is such a hard space in mis and disinformation to actually point to a definitive, objective, universally agreed to piece and say that is mis or dis.
And I guess the only people that are going to get rich out of this are going to be the lawyers that are arguing the toss on either side, right? Because
Totally.
it is definition that fundamentally it comes down to.
Totally. Absolutely.
Challenging, eh? Okay, I'm going to go back to one of my questions, which I hope answers the next few questions on the message board as well. And that is, if you had a magic wand, what would you change about the current state of the online content governance of New Zealand? It's a very open question.
Yeah, it really is. And I'm going to have to try and keep my answer succinct to it because I could talk about this for ages, right? I think that at its core, right, this is a challenge that's inherent to the internet and all of the platforms and everything that works on it. Why? And I don't pretend to be techie at all, so please, I beg your forgiveness to anybody who can put this in better or more technical terms, right? The internet was never designed to mediate content. It was never designed to judge content. And actual fact, has been put to me any number of times by far more learned people. Blocks in management and mediation of content is something that is usually seen as damage to the network that the internet can route around in a variety of different ways, right? So right from the outset, online content regulation is massively, massively difficult because it's not what this technology, this broad set of technologies was ever designed to do. This technology was designed to share stuff, not only the stuff that is good. So we'll start with that, and then I go into all of those other definitional challenges that we've touched on that, again, we could rant about for ages too, in terms of all of the different ways of judging what content is difficult as well. And that's hard here in New Zealand, and it's hard worldwide, as well as then seeing and mediating when that stuff comes up across billions or trillions of potential pieces of content on a daily basis. So now that I've done a 2-minute job of talking about all the problems that I see in this space, with my magic wand, I'll try and talk about some solutions that I think, Andrew Cushion, private citizen, would be really good and useful. One, there's a perennial issue about who, where, and what you go to for help. Why? Because there's a preponderance of agencies, both public and private, that offer help in this regard, and a lot of confusion and overlaps and underlaps about whose powers exist where. And anybody who has been in the space knows about that, right? Because different things fall through different gaps, and different things overlap in different gaps, and different agencies do or do not arguably do their piece of the puzzle. So I think some harmonization almost, or overview, or streamlining, or assistance in terms of where you go specifically would both point out to all of us as users who can help when and what gaps there are too. Number two thing that I think, we don't know a lot about how issues of content regulation specifically impact here in Aotearoa. I think we've got a real data deficit in terms of exactly what some of these things mean here in New Zealand as well, specific to us and specific to our values and our people. And the third thing that I would say is I think we've got a funding gap, because there are heaps of passionate people and organisations that want to do more in this broad category of spaces. It is hard to get money to do that, and that is usually the predominant constraint in terms of them doing more of that. And again, in that disinfo work, that was some of the stuff that we saw quite large, presented quite largely, right? A lack of data in terms of exactly what that means here in New Zealand, and a lack of funding for any number of organisations to do more about it. So, with my magic wand, right? Sort out who's doing what at the moment so we all know, get some data going, and fund other organisations to do more stuff is what I'd do.
Nice. I like I like all of them. As you know, in the cybersecurity space, I was an advocate for the government having a single front door. So there's just one number you ring if you've got a cybersecurity anything, for example. So simplifying the point of contact and knowing who to contact is really important. But that funding thing, with my DECA hat on, I speak to lovely, well-meaning people in community groups and charities who want to do more in the online safety space, but no one is funding online safety mahi at the moment, which is very depressing to hear. Now,
I want to put my code hat on specifically before we move off that point.
Okay.
So, right, quite tangibly, if I had a hat with the logo on it, I'd be putting it on. This is why I am happy to be doing this particular work, though, because even though it's a piece of self-regulatory stuff, even though it's on some massive issues and everything else, this works. These organizations, these companies, these multinational platforms have voluntarily made these commitments here in Aotearoa and said that we are happy to be independently judged about how well we're doing, right? All other things being equal, that is better than we had before this existed. Is it perfect? I'm not going to purport it's perfect, right? But they have made a commitment to this country. And we are relatively unique in that regard. At the time the code started, that had never been done before. And I think that I do genuinely think that that is overlooked sometimes in terms of this conversation. There is no other country at the time that could point to it and say that these multinational corporations have made commitment to us, right? And we have that here. No, I don't think it was designed to stop anything else from happening because, to be really blunt and uncharitable, we're a little market at the bottom of the world, right? We don't quite make waves the way that we'd like to think we do necessarily in terms of some of these spaces. But we made a wave here in terms of having a framework that had these large companies turn around and say, I'll commit to that. Now, I think that's something we can do more.
So on that front, I was going to ask you a couple of questions. One of them was, are there other jurisdictions doing things that we should be following? And potentially that's broader than just a self-regulating code, but have you seen other things around the world that New Zealand could be adopting?
I have. I'll talk about some of my favourites, though, actually. I think, and some of my favourites aren't necessarily because they're good, if that makes sense, right? Europe is pointed to, though, in a positive sense, in terms of at least exploring a lot of the boundaries around this particular regulatory space. And we all know that in terms of how Europe has been pushing a lot more of the safety infrastructure. A lot of that has been armed too, though, of longer running, more institutional embedment of civil society organisations, funding instruments for civil society, research from civil society that helped round out a fuller picture of what it means for European nations and European peoples. I think that's a really important point about how and why Europe is in such a leadership space around a lot of these issues, because they have a fuller and more involved public sphere around it, right? Which is why I think it's so important that more can be done here by people that aren't government as well to help with this particular space. So look at that. I'm really curious to see how the Australian set of measures around the under 16 ban play out. And again, this isn't a code matter, so this is Andrew Cushing, private citizen, talking to. Banning really doesn't usually work. And with what I imagine is predominantly a tech-minded audience here, you will get that probably more so than most too. It is such a deceptively alluring prospect to just say, oof, it's banned. And thus all of the problems are solved. And I'm going to be really interested to watch Australia and see how that works. And there is a little bit of me from a tech perspective that despairs a little bit that we've taken that easy poof solution potentially here in New Zealand too. I would really rather that this was a space around how younger New Zealanders can use these platforms to express themselves more in a safe space than just banning them from even trying to work that out without and I say that too, recognizing that there is still harm there. I just think that banning is such an ineffectual cop-out, to be blunt.
And then there's all the other consequences of the ban, which is having to verify all of us as being over the age of 16. So age verification for every citizen who's on one of these platforms blows my mind. Deep breath in.
And
anyway,
I've been thinking, I am going to take that bait just a little bit further. I mean, again, this is my independent personal thoughts here, right? But when we first introduced the drinking age of 18 here with more stringent requirements as to prove how you're 18 in terms of a driver's license or under 18 card, that was able to back itself off community infrastructure, right? i.e. the driver's license or the under 18 card, over 18 card, whatever it was. That meant that the bottle store had something they could rely on that was authoritative to tell them who that person was. What's the digital equivalent of that here?
Exactly.
Right? We don't have that civil age-based infrastructure here that means that we could point to anybody, be it platforms and otherwise, say, oh, yeah, just refer to that. We may not want that to happen as well due to all of those philosophical, jurisdictional things too. So I just think this turns into a massive can of worms.
Yep, I think it is. So let's not go there. I'm just going to ask you a couple of quick things from the audience, and then I've got one last main question for you before we wrap up. There's been quite a few questions from Ivan and other people about AI and whether the code and the design of the code and the measures in the code have considered AI and algorithms in the state that they're in today. I guess it's a fit for purpose kind of question.
I don't think sufficiently, because the code was about 2 and a bit years old now, coming up to 3 years old. And at least colloquially, a lot of that AI explosion, both benefits, uses, and concerns, has been in that time. I think it's an area that we need to look at. I'm going to segue this answer into another point that I really desperately want to make. Please,
Go
Vic.
for it.
One of my big commitments in doing this role was that we're going to review the code, though, right? We committed to do a review about now. It is my job to review this. It is to do so, as the Oversight Committee has encouraged me, as authentically and broadly as possible to hear the range of perspectives about what we need this code to do. I think that's one of the areas that we need to be talking about.
And that was the next question I was going to ask. Was Flash had a question about independent review or self-review of the aims and outcomes of the code, not just reviewing the platform's compliance with the code. So you're saying review the code is a complete thing. That's fantastic. Yep. So I guess that leads to the last question that I said I wanted to pose for you, and that is, what should we expect next from the code? Are there changes or improvements coming? So you've said you're going to review the code. What else can we expect now that Andrew Cushion's in the executive director role?
So there are 3 things that I'm here to do, right? And the first one is to increase the visibility of the code. Why? Because people won't use or expect things from the set of commitments unless they know that they exist. And so that the code exists and that these measures and instruments are there, I think is an important part of its credibility to increase its visibility. Thank you for having me here as part of this visibility thing. Not that you knew that before you invited me. Number 2, to increase the number of signatories to the code. Proud and thank you to the organisations that have signed up to it. I'm pushing particularly through a series of conversations to get more New Zealand-based organisations and content hosts and the likes to be members of our code instrument as well as trying to increase its breadth too, right? And then number 3, that review that I talked about, and I'm seeking to kick that off late July, early August. The encouragement / instruction that I have from the Oversight Committee is that this needs to hear the range of perspectives that we have around this particular piece. It'll be beholden upon me and the Oversight Committee to hold that balance that I'm talking about what New Zealanders expect versus what the signatories will sign up to and how we hold that. And that's something that I'd love to come back to you, ITP, you, Vic, in terms of whether and how your membership community and any number of membership communities can participate in that process.
And also participation of community, the hard to reach are hard to reach. So how do you actually enable them to have a voice in this kind of conversation? And that's quite challenging. No, that was great, and a great place to end. Graham mentioned that Meta have a transparency report which talks about them having warning labels on 2 million pieces of content on Facebook in 2024. So it'd be great through this process, actually, if as part of your lifting the awareness of the code, also helping lift awareness of the ways that people can find out more and complain, and all of the questions that we've had today. Kush, just to add that to your to-do list, that'd be fantastic. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being so open, and thank you for doing the take your hats off Andrew Cushion, Executive Director of the Code, and Andrew Cushion, Private Citizen, gave excellent answers to questions. Sorry to everyone, we didn't get to all of the questions on the Q&A, but I'll flip those through to Cush and he might come back with some answers that I can send out when we send out the recording. Thanks for your time today. I hope you're staying warm and dry and all of those things. And I'll say ka kite.
Goodbye.